All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm joined today by my Deputy Leader, Raki Pancholi, as well as several members of my caucus, the Shadow Ministers for Health, for Education, for Tourism and Sport, and other members of my caucus to express our concern with the commonly known as anti-trans bills that will be tabled today. Now look, today is a very heavy day, and I want to talk to you as a politician. So I'll start by talking to you as a politician. And as a politician, I will tell you that I have been in every corner of this province these last 4 months. We've talked to Albertans of every stripe, from every background, and I will tell you that punching down on trans kids does not appear in the top 50 of things Albertans are concerned about. Yet this government has fully 1/4 of all of their legislation in this session is on anti-trans legislation, something no one is asking for. Indeed, the only healthcare and education bills coming forth this session are bills to satisfy people who may or may not vote for the Premier this Saturday. There's nothing about hiring more EAs or giving more funding from the lowest funding in the country per student to the education system. There's nothing about cleaning up backlogs in the healthcare system or getting more family doctors in. These are the only things they want to talk about, healthcare and education. So that's the politician. Now I want to talk to you as a human being. As an uncle, as a teacher, as someone who has been lucky enough to work with young people for a long time. Today is a rough day. Today is a day where Albertans in every corner of this province are going to ask themselves, is there a place for me here? Is this a place where I can grow up and have a decent life and live an authentic life and have a life of dignity and a life of opportunity? And I'm not just talking about trans kids. Every single kid who thinks that maybe they're a little different in some way, which is every single kid. Every single kid is only going to have one question today. And that question is, am I next? You know, we make a lot of political hay over the fact that the Premier doesn't act like a Premier. She doesn't act like she's governing a province. She doesn't seem to have any interest in governance. She acts like she is, as Raki said yesterday, the Premier of a party, not the Premier of a province. And this callous, venal, evil act that they're bringing forward today is just so she can get a few votes on a Saturday night in Red Deer. And you know what? Albertans deserve way better than that. Let's go to questions.
Just state your name and outlet before you speak.
I was going to say Naheed Nenshi, leader of Alberta's New Democrats.
This is Naheed Nenshi, leader of the yes, sorry. Go ahead, Cindy. You might as well start off.
Cindy Tran with the Edmonton Journal. So back in January, the Premier had come out with this social media video announcing that she plans on putting a ban on gender-affirming surgeries for trans youth. Minors. What is your take on that?
So we don't know what's in the bill yet. But what we do know is that when the Premier made her announcement by video at the end of January, you know, when that video started, for a fleet second I had hope. It was all soft lights and soft words, and she talked about her love for people in the trans community. And she then portrayed to outline the most heinous, most rigorous anti-trans legislation, anti-sex ed legislation that we've seen anywhere in the country. And what we understand from the Premier is that despite a summer, in fact almost a year, of consultations, that nothing has changed. That she's putting forward precisely what she said she would back in January before any consultation. And the critical thing to remember about this is, look, if I were to say to you, people shouldn't make irreversible life-altering surgeries before they are mentally developed to do that, I think most people would say, that's a legit thing to say. But here's the thing. No bottom surgeries are performed in Canada, period, on people under 18. No bottom surgeries are performed. Now it is against the law. As for, they call them top surgeries, let's call them what they are, breast reduction surgeries. A tiny, tiny, tiny number, fewer than a couple hundred a year, are performed on people usually when they're 17 years old with parental consent after years of medical and therapeutic treatment. So yeah, let's change that for a few hundred people. But what happens is it goes way beyond that. The Premier starts by saying things that people might agree with, but then beyond that takes away rights. You know, she's going to talk a lot about parents' rights today. And what she's actually done is she's taken away parents' rights. And I can tell you about two very specific ways in which she's taken away rights from parents. The first is today, with parental consent, with a doctor's recommendation, in a rare number of cases, children can be prescribed reversible medication to help slow down their physical development while they're working on their psychological development. This is, in most parts of the world, considered best practice. And what the Premier has done is she has taken away the choice from parents, doctors, and children to get what might be medical best practice for them. She is denying them treatment, despite the fact that they just put a Bill of Rights saying people should have the right to access medical treatment. She's denying them the best care medical treatment for them. She's denying to many, many parents the opportunity to have their kids participate in sport. Because let's be clear, the experts on this, and particularly Canadian women in sport, feel that this kind of legislation will actually reduce the participation of all children in sport, particularly women, because sport suddenly will no longer feel welcoming. So she's denying a lot of parents the opportunity to put their kids, young kids, little kids, into sport. She's denying athletes the opportunity to compete nationally and internationally if Alberta is out of sync with other national and international sporting organizations. For example, the universities are not sure they'll be able to compete in inter-university sport. So again, denying choices, taking away freedoms. I could go on and on and on, but this is really what this is about. It's nothing about freedom, it's about ideology.
A second question in regards to education. So the Edmonton Journal spoke to ATA a couple months back in January when this was announced, and part of the policies that the Premier had mentioned at the time was to have teachers, principals, potentially oust students who may want to change their pronouns or names. What kind of environment do you think that sets up these rules?
When I first heard about this legislation, before I was in politics, before I was back in politics, the thing that I was immediately scared of was the forced outing of students. I got a lot of friends in the LGBTQ plus community, and universally they will tell me that their right to write their own coming out story, to determine when and where it made sense for them, is one of the most pivotal developmental things in their entire life. But what we know is worse than that. For the majority of kids who have supportive families at home, here's the thing. The parents already know. They know before the school knows. And even if the student is not formally out at home, the parents know. And maybe the kids want to try out what the reaction would be on a couple of other adults before talking to their parents. What we're talking about is the kids who do not feel safe at home and are looking to a trusted adult to look for advice, to talk about how things should be able to work. And these are the kids who are at great risk. So we know that this government polled on this issue. We know that this government tried to figure out which vulnerable group was perhaps the one they could punch down on because they were the least popular. And to me, it doesn't matter what you think about trans people. If you don't think trans people deserve dignity and authenticity, you're wrong, and I'll convince you, but that's not the point. The point is, you've elected a government, we've elected a government, that thinks it's okay to punch down on kids who have outsized risk of self-harm and suicide already. And a recent peer-reviewed article has very clearly shown that in jurisdictions with anti-trans legislation, that risk of self-harm and suicide can increase by as much as 70%. So I was telling a story, and I was saying that when I first heard about this, I reached out to the Premier's office as a non-politician and said, you can't forcibly out students. And lately, and I don't know what's in the legislation, but lately what we've heard from the Premier is that she's not interested in forcibly outing students. But what she is instead doing is saying you have two choices. We tell your parents, or you stay in the closet. Again, restricting people's freedoms to only those two choices. Go ahead, Jonathan.
So the Alberta government has justified these bills by saying they're copying various American states and European countries with similar policies. What is your opinion on that rationale?
Well, if there were any medical experts here in Alberta who agreed with them, I would be much more sympathetic to it. And look, the science on this is fluid. You know, things will change over time. But I don't know that the Premier has spent any time talking to, for example, the Canadian Pediatric Association, talking to people who are actually working with folks in this situation every day about their very grave concerns and their very grave risks. You know, this is not just a social issue. It's not an ideological issue for us. It's not a thing that woke people are worried about. These are professionals who are deeply concerned about the physical and emotional risk to these children.
So the Alberta government might need to use the notwithstanding clause to uphold these policies, because in Saskatchewan there was the case where they had to use the notwithstanding clause to uphold the parental rights bill. What do you think about the Alberta government's possible use of the notwithstanding clause with this legislation? Should it be struck?
I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I play one in media scrums. I know the Canadian Constitution pretty well. The notwithstanding clause is the nuclear option of the Canadian Constitution. It is only to be used in times of egregious harm to people's freedoms. And the preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause, which, as Scott Moe did in Saskatchewan, is something that was never contemplated by the framers of the Constitution. You know, Danielle Smith loves nothing more than the founding fathers of the American Constitution. And this is something that would never in a million years be allowed. So for a premier who loves to call herself the most freedom-loving premier in the world, to use a clause that explicitly restricts people's freedoms tells you everything you need to know about Danielle Smith.
Since that video was introduced in January, but a number of groups that plan to challenge whatever we may see legally, is that something that your party would consider joining in terms of?
Yeah, we'll have to see what's in the bill. And certainly I have spoken publicly in support of organizations like Skipping Stone and EGAL, who are looking to do legal challenges to this bill, and that's certainly something we'll look at very carefully, with or without the notwithstanding clause.
One more question, anyone? Catherine Bukowski, Alberta Today. One of the things, there's been some consultation, but we don't know who was consulted. There's been very loud voices. We saw a tabling of petitions. What do you think about the consultation? How this consultation?
What consultation? Here's the thing. This government has a reflex, and the reflex is to not be transparent. The reflex is not to tell anybody anything, whether it's who paid for my hockey tickets to who did I talk to on this issue. We're the opposite. We believe in ultimate transparency. And the only thing we know about these consultations is that the government handpicked people who already agreed with them. And we've seen one or two video clips of people who didn't agree with them at these consultations vehemently not agreeing with them. This government has stopped publishing what we call what we heard documents, which are documents after any consultation that says who was there and what did they say, because they're scared. Because they fully know, like on the Alberta Pension Plan, like on Bill 20 with the municipalities, that real consultation will lead to only one thing, which means everybody hates this. And they won't tell us that. So listen, I'm standing right here, and the people on this dais with me have spoken to 1,000 times as many Albertans on this issue as the government has. And I will tell you very clearly the results of our consultation. Quit picking on vulnerable people. All right, thanks everybody.